Alright, Alyna, if you want to throw your PayPal back in the chat again for Len, just so that he doesn't have to try and remember it and or find it. I'm assuming he would appreciate that.
Just use the same one that Saven used. If you have that handy. Let me see if I can pull that up. Or he can type it up into chat. There we go.
Oh, that's faster than I could find it too.
Yeah.
Sweet. I finished my satchel.
I saw the pictures. That's excellent.
It looks very nice.
And it is now 6 o'clock. No time for the worry. So I'm gonna go ahead and start the recording and then screen share the beginning of your slide and give the spiel.
Perfect. Thank you.
This is Journeyman Alyna's class, Beginner Mistakes with Commercial Patterns. If this class runs long, you'll be able to find her in the Chaos Wars Discord channel, where she will be there to answer any of your questions. It ends at 7 o'clock. Go ahead and take it away, Alyna.
Hey, everybody. How is your evening going? Ooh, let's have me up there pinned. Why can't I pin myself? Anyway, so here we have beginner mistakes with commercial patterns. Hold that thought. Hey, Sven, can you shut your door? We're getting a bit of echo. We're in the same house. That's much better. Thank you. So yes, as most of you know, you're familiar with commercial patterns. You have the big four, which is simplicity, which is backwards for you guys, Butterick, McCall's, and the little lesser known Berta. But there's one thing true with every single commercial big four pattern that you will find, is that the sizing is totally crazy and messed up and has nothing whatsoever to do with fashion sizes that you get at the clothing store or wherever you buy your clothes. You'll go into the store to go buy a pair of jeans, and they're say you're a size 2. Well, when you come on over to a commercial pattern, their sizes are based on measurements, and a person that is a size 2 in like a garment at a store will be a size 12 sometimes in a commercial pattern. So you have to pick your size based on your measurements, and these sizes are based on a rather antiquated size blocking, but that's a whole another can of worms that we can discuss later. Based off of 50s measurements. Okay. And red. So most typically you go for your chest, your waist, and your hip size to pick the size for your pattern. And if you look at the back of your pattern, I wish I had saved pictures and stuff, you will see all the information that you need to pick your size. And for a woman who has a 36 bust and a 28-inch waist and a 38 hip, she will wear a size 14. And I know I'm not alone when I say a size 14, but this woman that's usually this size wears a size small or medium. And so it can be rather depressing, but it helps to know this ahead of time and not be surprised. Because if you just go into a pattern and be like, okay, I'm a size 12, so I'll just start making a size 12 pattern, and then you put the garment on and it doesn't fit at all, you don't want to run into that surprise. The next that you can find when you're making a garment is it has this thing called ease. And ease is used for pattern drafting so that you can move and do things, or it's a style choice in your garment. And the pattern, the big four, never really, they do sometimes tell you how much ease they've put in, but sometimes they don't. And so if you make a certain size thinking that, oh, it's going to fit me because based on my measurements, and it comes out way too huge, that's because there's like triple the amount of ease in the pattern. So you can kind of finagle, like if it has like 6 inches of ease instead of 3 inches of ease, you can probably go down a size if there's that much ease. You just gotta look. And in the case of knit patterns that are exclusively made for knit fabrics, example, this one right here, this is a knit fabric. These patterns have what's called negative ease. I know, as if it wasn't complicated enough. And they don't tell you this, that it has negative amount of ease, because knit fabrics automatically stretch. And so there's a stretchability in the fabric. When you have a woven fabric, there is none of that stretch. And so you need the positive ease in your pattern in order for the garment to be comfortable. Because if the garment has 0 ease in it, the only pattern you want to have 0 or negative ease with a woven fabric is a corset. Otherwise, you are not going to be comfortable. You're not going to be able to move. And we are just blasting right through. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Anna, my measurements from high school. Well, yes. We can all dream to be, that perfect boop or, hourglass shape. But we grow older and those measurements go away. So next we have is, okay, you have picked your size, you have picked your pattern, and you open the folder up. Here, let's do a brand new one. You open the folder up and you find all this paper. You find the tissue paper, which is the pattern, and then you find this little pamphlet inside. And Simplicity, this is Simplicity's, they show you a nice little fashion drawing, and then they show you what the pattern like, and then they label them. And then they start giving you cutting layouts. And what's really important to do before you even pick your fabric, or you can pick your fabric, but before you even dream of cutting your fabric, read these papers and read it all the way through so that you know what to expect when you get to page 4 and you need, say for example, if you're putting in a zipper, I need a zipper foot because we're putting in a zipper, or oh my gosh, I didn't know I needed this XYZ thing. And you're cruising through your make, and then all of a sudden you get to this next step and you're like, oh man, I don't have that tool, and you have to stop. So always important to read through the instructions all the way through so that there are no surprises. And you don't have to follow the order in which they do things sometimes. You can change the order. Master Sven, I feel called. No, not calling you out at all, Sven. You can rearrange sometimes, like if you want to do, for example, my satchel tutorial that I just did a couple of hours ago. I decided to do the strap first before I built any of the rest of the bag. And in my tutorial, in my instructions, we built the bag first and the lining and the flap and then made my straps. And I decided to switch that order while presenting that class. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just some steps require a certain order of operations, and sometimes you can rearrange when you do that order of operations. But most of the time, when you have instructions like these that are constructed by the Big Four, their patterns have been tested by no less than 10 people. And these people are professionals that test these patterns and help write out these instructions. And the order in which they want you to do things can sometimes be the best, if not the easiest path you can take in constructing your garment. So next topic on my little handy dandy list, if anyone had a chance to look at the handout, is that we're going to talk about grain line. And grain line isn't really something that they talk about in the pattern. I mean, they have this brief little blurb about it. Oh no, it's not even on here. For when, oh yes, it's in the special cutting notes in regards to the grain line. And you will see when you open your pattern and look at a piece, it'll have this arrow on it. And this arrow with this big, huge arrow bottom will be pointing either up, down, or at a diagonal. And that arrow is what's called the grain line. And the grain line involves your fabric and the way things are cut. If you don't really have to, well, yeah, you kind of do have to follow it with knit fabrics. But let me grab my piece of fabric here. Okay, so the grain line refers to the yarns on which the direction in which the yarns are looped on the loom when they make a fabric. It typically follows the salvage edge. This is very clearly the salvage edge because this is a print fabric and you can definitely see the salvage edge. Therefore, you can definitely tell which direction your grain line is. And this is the lengthwise grain line. And it is the warp thread from the loom. So if you see a loom and here's a box, your warp thread is the one that's going vertical. And it's very important to keep garments on this line if it is specific to that line, because if you have it even off just a little bit, you start going into the bias area. And bias can really mess up the way the garment sits when you put the garment together. I mean, they have this handy dandy little cutout layout when you're looking at the instructions, and they put those there for a reason. Because if you just lay your pieces out, skitty-wompy, however you want, most of the time when you start putting those pieces together, if you cut them out, they're not going to sit right, and it's just going to look weird. And so you got to be precise when it comes to cutting out your garment, and it'll always tell you that it'll be labeled, this is the grain line, and you want to line that up as best you can. So when you lay out your fabric on whatever your cutting surface is, find your salvage edge and use a ruler to line up your grain line with the salvage edge. Say if you're in the middle of a fabric and you don't have a salvage edge on either end, you just need to look closely at the way the weave is done. The cross grain, which is this way, has a bit more stretch, whereas the grain line has 0 to nil stretch, like it doesn't want to move. The cross grain, which is the weft on the loom, has a little bit of stretch. The grain line has almost nil stretch. And what causes your garment to go wonky is when it goes on the bias. And if it goes on the bias, then you have a lot of stretch. I mean, that can totally mess up your garment. And so just to review, your salvage edge runs the same direction as your grain line. The cross grain goes 90 degrees and it has a little bit of stretch. Grain line, no stretch. Cross grain, a little bit of stretch. True bias, or a 45-degree angle, has lots of stretch. And it's really important when you cut things out that you follow the direction of the grain line on your pattern. Otherwise, things just look weird and hang wrong, or they don't come together quite right. So our next step is be precise and accurate. And one of the things that my husband, Master Sven, learned in his most recent, well, not recent, a little bit ago, was that, you know, he cut everything out, but he didn't mark any of the notches or other markings that are on the pattern. And
I am continually learning this over many projects.
Yes. Put in your notches and any other dots that come on your pattern piece. They're typically in the arm's eye, on the side seam, on curves, at the top of the curve and the bottom of the curve, in, say, if you're doing a princess seam or something like that. Always put in your notches and any other markings that are on your pattern piece, because if you don't have these, then sometimes you get to start constructing your garment and you're like, I have no idea if this is the right sleeve or the left sleeve, if this is the front or the back. And typically those notches are there to help you. And always notch your pattern pieces. Always, always, always. The dots are there for balancing points for a curve. Sometimes you can get away without using them, but I always say mark all the little special markings that you have. And again, those are typically in your instructions, and they'll give you a little guideline of, oh, these are the markings that we use in this pattern, and hey, you should pay attention to these. The other part of being precise and accurate is you'll want to test things before you work on your pretty fashion fabric. So this involves making a mock-up. And making a mock-up, impossible to follow the pattern. No, it's not impossible, Fuegos. It is possible, I promise. If you ever need help, I will walk you through a pattern. I promise. It is intuitive. But back to my thought is make a mock-up of the garment that you're making and make it out of something cheap like muslin, or you can go to your nearest thrift store and use a pair of sheets from their decor section and make your mock-up out of the cheap fabric. That way you don't cry when you get through 90% of your project and your garment doesn't fit and you spent $20 a yard on your fashion fabric, hypothetically, and you won't just absolutely break down and cry into a fetal position because things are ruined because you didn't make a mock-up. Take a drink because I've been talking. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right. So the next topic we're going to talk about is choosing the correct fabric. And sometimes when you look at a pattern, you'll be like, oh, there's a little spot near the top on the back, and it says suggested fabrics, and it'll list XYZ. Yes, we know this because we've done it. Yes, you want to pick the right fabric for your pattern. For example, prime example, my pattern here. You don't want to pick a pretty brocade to make with this pattern because this pattern is designed specifically for knit fabrics. So they recommend, a knit or a stretch velvet or something that has knit that has stretch to it. And the only woven fabric piece that is part of this pattern is that belt there. And they have recommendations for that. Say, for example, this pattern right here. You'll want to pick a structured fabric to make this dress because that's the way the pattern is drafted. Len had a question is, how do you know the pattern wants which type of fabric? They have the fabric recommendation on the back, on the back of the envelope, and it'll usually be in this top left corner. And you can tell what they have. For example, for this pattern right here, they recommend a lightweight to medium weight upholstery fabric, tapestry fabric, velveteen, wool blends, or poplin. So some very structured medium weight to heavyweight fabrics. And then for the sleeves, the little puffy parts here and the sleeves here, they recommend a lighter sheer kind of fabric so that it has that nice drape to it instead of structure. So for the main part of the dress, they want you to have a medium to heavyweight fabric, and then for the poofs that have a little bit more drape to them, they want you to use a lightweight or sheer. And another thing that you want to do when you pick your fabric, once you've picked your fabric and everything, you'll want to check to see whether or not the fabric shrinks. Now, we use a lot of natural fibers in our sport because we prefer to do it that way, because natural fibers breathe. Polyester fabrics, which is plastic, let me say that again. Polyester fabric is plastic and does not breathe. And therefore, that's the reason why you're overheating and dying on the field when your fabric content for your material is 100% polyester. It doesn't breathe. And so once you have picked your correct fabric, you want that you pre-shrink it before you manipulate the fabric to make your garment, be it cut it or whatever. Some materials don't need to be pre-shrunk, like brocades or upholstery fabric. You want to avoid that. Leita says, I'm so bad at pre-washing. I have made it a religion to where, like, if it's a woven fabric that I know is 100% natural fiber, the first thing I do when I get it from wherever I buy it is it goes immediately into the washing machine, and the washing machine and dryer. I don't even mess around with that stuff because I know that if I just take the fabric and take it downstairs to my shop, it's not going to get washed. And I'm going to cry later after I wash the garment and everything's shrunk up a little bit and it doesn't sit right because I didn't pre-shrink my fabric. Very, very important step when you use woven fabrics, especially when you're working with linen or wool. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, Catherine says, I follow that same procedure. It's okay, Leita. I know. Let's hammer that in there is like, what, pre-wash your fabrics, unless, it's a fancy fabric that, you don't want to ruin them by washing. Some just pay attention to the fabric content and what the washing instructions are. So my next topic is pressing and clipping. So you've cut your garment out already, and you've put all your notches and stuff, and you're starting to do your seams. And you finish a seam. Let's say you're doing a princess seam for, that has this nice little curve going on. And you managed to finagle it in there and everything, and then it's time to move on to your next seam. But press your seam before moving on to the next. If you press as you go, then you don't have to do it all at the end. And people are like, oh, I hate having the iron right next to me. Ugh. The iron's clear across the room. Why do I have to do this? It's very important. Pressing seams after they've been sewn not only controls what your seam allowance is doing, it also, most of the time we're working with polyester thread, it melds the thread to your fabric. And because if you don't press that, then the thread's just kind of sitting on top of your fabric and is not kind of melding in. And Sven says, called out once again. Yes. I'm calling you all out. I don't do it half the time either. I am calling myself out. Pressing is very, very important. Almost as important as this next point, which is clipping your curves and corners. Yes, the seam looks absolutely pretty. Backing up just a little bit, the seam looks absolutely pretty after you've pressed it. And here's another tidbit for when you're pressing seams. Most of the time, those seams you're pressing those seams towards the center body mass. So my turn to feel called out. Yes, but those seams, say for example, our princess seams, you want to press those towards center mass, so towards center front. And when you have seams that are on the back that are curved or whatever, you want to press those towards center back. Same thing as if you were doing darts. You want to press those towards the center mass instead of out to the sides. So in order to also get while pressing to get those curves to lay flat, is you want to clip the curve. And sometimes you have to take a little triangle out when you clip the curve, or you just have to clip it so it'll bend. Convex curves, you'll want to what I call slash clips, where you just clip, 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 just a straight line. But concave curves, you want to take little triangles out of your seam allowance so that it lays flat when you press, and it'll look prettier. And the fabric will lay just so, and you'll have this nice smooth curve after you've pressed it. How am I doing on time? 6:30. Okay. Another thing that they never, ever, ever, ever mention in the instructions or any time, and it's something that you inherently kind of learn after you've sewn for a while, and this thing is you have to backstitch whenever you do a seam. So you move forward a little bit and then you backtrack a couple of steps and then continue on with your seam. In every instruction pamphlet that I have ever seen, never, ever, ever, ever tells you to backstitch. And you always do this, because if you don't backstitch at a seam and you start, say you have 3 seams in your bodice, you have your center front, your curved princess seam, and then you have your side seam. Well, you've done your princess curve and you're starting to work on your center front or something, and you didn't backstitch on your princess seam. Well, as you're manipulating things and trying things and stuff, your seam starts coming apart because you didn't backstitch. And then you're going, oh no, what's it doing? It's falling apart. That's the importance of backstitching. Very, very, very important. So you've been, going along, you've done one seam, and then you come up to a thing that says baste so-and-so together with so-and-so. And you're like, baste? What is this word, baste? Sometimes in this little handy-dandy, general directions thing, it'll have a definition of what basting is. Most of the time, it does not. Basting is a long temporary stitch that you run through where your seam would be to hold pieces together temporarily before you do your final seam. Now, basting can be done either by hand stitching with long whip stitches, or it can be a long running stitch. What? A long running stitch that you can run on your machine. Say, for example, another example of when you would use basting is if you had a lining and your fashion fabric and it says to flatline the pieces together. How would you do that? Well, to flatline the pieces together, you would use a basting stitch, just so that those pieces don't move around while you're stitching your seams. That's what basting is. Another thing that they'll say in the instructions as you're going along is do whatever seam finish you prefer. Now, our lovely Journeyman Alyna had a whole class on seam finishes earlier today, and that class will be available on the wiki, and the links for that recording are in the Discord. So I am just going to skip over that little bit. But basically, the basic seam finishes for when you're making your garment are you use pinking shears, which has the diagonal cut to it, a zigzag or serger, felled seams, French seams, etc. Does anyone have any questions? Fuegos's comment does not make any sense. Turkey, make sure it doesn't dry out. Seam finishings is important. Go watch the recording or see your tutorial. Basting, oh yes. They are spelled the same way, unfortunately. So, I lost my train of thought. There it is. Okay. So when it comes time and you're cutting your pattern out, it can be done, Fuegos, is you'll have pattern pieces that say place on the fold. And you're wondering, why are they placing pattern pieces on the fold? The reason why they're putting pattern pieces on the fold is because it's a shortcut. And it's the way they have things lined out on their cutout layout. It saves time, supposedly, but it can be incredibly inaccurate sometimes because things move when you trace them out onto your fabric, or most importantly, things move when you're cutting things out, and so your garment can be off askew, and sometimes that fold isn't on the grain line. It'll be just shy of the bias or a slight bias, and so things will not be accurate. Most tailors and commercial makers, people that make garments professionally and commercially, don't hardly ever cut anything out on the fold. So if you by chance end up don't really care about putting things on the fold, you can put it on the fold. I'm not saying you can't. Just make sure that things don't move when you're cutting on the fold, and make sure your fold is on the grain line. My next tip is to fit the garment as you're making it. So, you know, you have everything cut out, you have basically the shoulder seams on. You should try the garment and see if things are fitting right. Because it would really suck if you got 90% through a garment and all you have to do is the hem, and you have this very fabulous fancy fabric, and you've gone through all this work to make this garment and you didn't fit it along the way, and you go to put the garment on and nothing fits. Again, crying in the corner in the fetal position because you just blew $100 worth of fabric on a garment that no longer fits you. So always remember to fit the garment as you go along. A great stage to fit the garment and make sure that everything fits is when you get to the point in the instructions and say, okay, you've gone through XYZ, and then the next step says repeat for lining. This is an excellent point at which to try the garment on and see if it fits, and make adjustments before you start making the lining, because since once you have fit everything in that and you go to make the lining, you can make those adjustments at the lining and you don't have to fit it twice. And everyone is happy. And my last little point before I sign off for everybody is, no matter what your skill level and no matter what you do, sometimes things go wrong. And you get halfway through a project and things just totally go bonkers, and you think you followed the instructions exactly, and something goes wrong. Here's my advice. Take a breath, however long that breath needs to be. If it's 10 minutes, hour, overnight, take a breath, relax, and then backtrack through your steps that you've gone through and see where you might have gone wrong. I have kind of a little anecdote. One summer, right before I graduated college, I worked with a young lady that, oh yes, what Master Sven said, like you might put the sleeve on the front and back instead of where the armholes go. There's a specific pattern that he did that with. It was for a puffy shirt. That puffy shirt is still incomplete to this day. I have it in my UFO pile to be fixed later, if it's fixable. But yes. He put the sleeves at the front and back seam and tried to put the yoke in where the arm's eye goes, and yes. But back to my anecdote. I worked with this young lady, and I'm fairly certain I had marked the notches for the sleeve for a garment. Sleeves are hard, by the way, sometimes. And this young lady put the sleeve in backwards 3 times. She spent 5 hours trying to fix this sleeve and how it was not going in right. Ultimately, she passed she left in frustration, crying out the door, and passed the garment on to someone else because she could not figure out how she was putting the sleeve on wrong 3 times in a row. So what she was failing to do was that she was putting the sleeve wrong side to right side together. See you 3 and raise you 5. And so she, instead of backing up and looking where her notches were on the garment and looking where her notches were on the sleeve, she unpicked, and I honestly have no idea how she managed to do this. But I remember when I first started sewing that I would put the right sleeve on the left arm and the left arm on the right sleeve, and that was because I wasn't paying attention to my front and back notches. That's part of the reason why I religiously notch sleeves and make sure that I know for certain which is the front of the sleeve and which is the back of the sleeve, because sleeves were my nemesis for forever, like 10 years. I have been sewing for 25. So aging myself. But for about 10 years, sleeves were my nemesis. And it was largely because I skipped that step of being precise and marking my projects. And now I'm religious about marking what's my front, what's my back, and all my sleeves. So those are the things that I have written down to talk about. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or whatever? Oh, Master Sven says, got any tips for extrapolating? Here's what he means. Okay, so here we have our big 4 pattern, which is for simplicity. And if you look at the pattern sleeve here, it goes from large to extra large. So if we flip it over here onto the back, and here's our little line that says is our sizes. The extra large for an adult male to fit, that person's chest has to be 48 inches around, all the way. Most of our guys that are in Belagarth, especially in my unit, my guys are big. And only the smallest, second to smallest guy in my unit has a 48-inch chest. A dear friend of mine, Squire Scald, his chest is 58 inches around. That boy's big. And so I have to scale up my pattern to fit him. And that's a whole nother art in and of itself. But the short and long of it is that you'll take the seam line, or the cutting line, yes, Scald with the full barrel chest. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to look at how they have graded the pattern. Yes, most women's patterns only go up to size 22. And yes, the largest petite women's size, their chest only goes up to a 44-inch. So you have to scale up the pattern in order to fit us bigger Americans, because we like our food, I guess, or something. But that would be a whole other class to show people how to scale up a pattern and have it be proportionate to the bigger person and actually fit correctly. Because sometimes when you scale it up too far, then it stops working. But a good pattern company that has a very wide range of patterns on it and is very accurate and is easy to use with sizing is the Berta, because they typically go up to for this one, this is a men's, this one will go up to a size 50. So it's not quite, it just goes up one size bigger. Occasionally you can find plus size patterns, but only for women, that will have been sized up and have the correct math and everything. But for the most part, if you have to size up for a man, you got to get some creative maths, and you got to understand how to pattern draft and have some of that knowledge of and relationship of how pattern drafting and proportional proportions work when it comes to pattern drafting. Typically, if you don't fit within the size that is within most commercial patterns, it's easier to draft your own, unfortunately. I mean, you can scale things up, but my biggest frustration is that I am somewhat aptly pear-shaped. I have broad shoulders, a smaller bust, a belly, and a booty. And none of these listed size guides here on this pattern fit for me. So I typically look for the size that is closest to my hip. I'm never going to have that perfect hourglass shape that is with these patterns. But you can figure it out. It takes some practice. But for our silhouettes that we use in Belagarth, there are plenty of tutorials out there that are useful and can fit and look the way we want them to. Does anyone else have any questions? I kind of skirted around that comment. Sorry. Questions, comments? So I have about 10 minutes left in my class, and it looks like Leta has stepped away from the keyboard.
I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Okay. So that is the extent of my prepared notes.
Sweet. I'll go ahead and end the recording then. And yeah, we got 9 minutes left. So anyone who comes up with questions, feel free to shoot them out to Alyna. We have Squire Antoinette and Sir Oroku